Hi everyone, my name is Sahas Barve and I'm a program director of avian ecology at Archbold Biological Station. Today we are going to talk about feathers and bird feathers. And this is part of this series of lectures on physiology and anatomy. And I thought we should spend a whole lecture on feathers. Not only because I think feathers are such a unique part about birds and bird anatomy and physiology, but also because I have studied feathers for the last 7 or 8 years now. So let's begin with a actual story of how I came to study feathers. So the personal inspiration for studying feathers came from a encounter with this bird, the gold crest, which took place in the high elevations of the Himalayas. So I was there studying for doing research for my PhD dissertation, and I was trying to understand how birds live at high elevations. So one day, one morning, it was really, really cold. It was about minus 10 degrees Celsius. And I was at about 10,000 feet above sea level. So it was really, really cold and it was really difficult to breathe. So I woke up in the morning and wore all the layers I had and then went out to look at birds and watch them forage for food to understand how they were feeding and what they were feeding on. And it was so dark and so rather so cold that for the first couple of hours I didn't actually see any birds. But then I heard a little chip note in a spruce tree, and I looked up, and there was this bird, the gold crest, which is a high elevation breeder in throughout the Himalayas, and it was feeding in this spruce tree. Now, as soon as I saw this bird, I was really excited to see it, and I wanted to take notes. So what I did was I quickly took my hand out of my mitten, and I started taking notes. But it was so cold that my hands immediately went numb, and I couldn't even write any longer. And that's when it struck me, this bird is doing was doing something incredibly like cool. So first of all birds, as I'm sure you've heard already, are supposed to maintain their internal body temperature at about 40 degrees C. Any lower or they start going into what is called hypothermic shock. Now the distance, so this bird, the gold crest, typically weighs about 6 grams, which is a teaspoon of sugar. Now imagine a bird that is so small and light, maintaining 40 degrees Celsius, which is, 3 or 4 degrees Celsius in more than us, constantly. Otherwise, it goes into hypothermic shock. And that's when I realized that a big part of how it was maintaining its internal body temperature was probably because it had puffed up its feathers to retain a lot of heat, just like this bird is doing in the photo. So that's when I made a mental note, and because I couldn't make a physical note, that I wanted to study feathers and how they help keep birds warm. And we'll come to that later in the lecture. So let's begin by understanding what feathers are. Feathers are what makes birds birds, right? So they are now, for all extant reptiles, only avian reptiles or avian dinosaurs have feathers. But feathers or feather like structures have evolved twice independently in the history of reptiles. Once, of course, in the lineage of avian dinosaurs, that are even present today as our extant birds. But now there's increasing evidence that pterosaurs, which were another group of flying reptiles, also had something that looked like feathers. So they were filamentous, scaly things that looked like feathers, but they probably were more important for camouflage or for attracting mates rather than for flying itself, like many birds do today. So bird feathers have three or four very important functions. If you look at fossil birds, the it is very clear that the first feathers did not evolve for flight, that feathers have been co opted for flight. The first feathers probably evolved in dinosaurs or avian dinosaurs as a adaptation for either insulation or for attracting mates or for crypsis. And feathers today also play all these three important roles. So here's an example of a screech owl, which is very similar to a scops owl in the Indian subcontinent. And look at how beautifully camouflaged this screech owl is. And you can hardly see it, even if it's sitting outside its tree hole where it lives during the day. So crypsis, or the way in which a animal hides, is also a important function that feathers provide. So feathers provide camouflage. The other thing that feathers do, of course, is help attract mates. And here's a great example of a Parodia from Papua New Guinea, which has this incredibly long skirt of feathers with a bright batch of iridescent feathers on its throat, and then these crazy feathers that grow out of its head that it uses in its amazing courtship display to attract mates. And finally, like our story before, feathers also play a big role in insulation. It keeps birds warm and actually forms a physical barrier between the outside air, which can be cold or hot, and its inside body temperature, and is a physical barrier that keeps the bird warm or cold. But of course, the most celebrated function of birds is their ability to fly. And most birds alive today use their feathers to fly. There are very few flightless birds left on Earth. And flight by itself is so complicated. There are some birds that are very slow flyers, some birds that can navigate, use their feathers to navigate through dense understory or dense overstory. Some birds, like hummingbirds here, actually can hover in place or fly backwards and forwards, and others, like this albatross, that can fly for many tens of miles without even flapping their feathers once. Their wing structure and their whole plumage is so aerodynamic that it helps them ride the currents above the ocean for many miles without even having to flap their wings even once. So flying, of course, or flight, is an important function for that feathers give birds. Okay, so let's talk about what a feather is made of. And we'll soon get into all the different kinds of feathers birds have, but the most number of feathers on a bird's body are what are called contour feathers, which are their body feathers. So all the feathers that are found on their belly and on their back and on their head, they're called contour feathers or body feathers. And they are made up of two major regions, each contour feather. So each feather on a bird is very similar to one hair on our skin. Okay, so consider each feather as a hair that you might have. So each contour feather is made up of two parts. The distal part, which is the part that is away from the body, is made up of what is called pennaceous barbs. And the proximal part, or the part that's close to the body, is made up of what is called plumulaceous barbs or downy barbs. So these downy barbs are actually non-interlocking. So they do this function of trapping a little pocket of air between in there to help keep the bird warm. While the distal pennaceous barbs are the ones that interlock with each other and form a insulative and colorful and water repellent layer for the bird. So if you have seen birds, and we'll talk about this more again, but if you've seen water just drip off a bird's body, that's because these pennaceous barbs in the bird's feather are helping the bird keep water away. So let's get a little more into those structures. So here is a another figure of what a feather looks like. So this is probably a wing feather, which has very little downy part, right? So wing feathers don't have that plumulaceous part, which helps keep them warm, but they have all the other structures. So here's a central rachis, and which starts as a calamus or shaft, which is partly embedded in the bird's skin. And so this rachis gives off barbs. So these barbs are right here, and they have what are called barbules. So barbs, feathers have a central rachis. Each rachis gives off barbs. Each barbs gives off many barbules. And those barbules are actually the ones that interlock with one another and help create a uniform surface. And this surface birds use not only to reflect color, but also to keep their body dry by repelling water. So there are many types of feathers on a bird's body, and many birds may have one or many types of feathers also. So these three feathers right here, tail feathers, wing feathers, and contour feathers, are probably present on most birds, other than the ones that are obviously flightless. They don't have wing feathers. But you can generally tell wing feathers when you find a feather on the ground. You can generally tell a wing feather because typically it has a very specific shape. So look at this wing feather from an Amazon parrot that has a very specific shape, right? So because it forms a part of the wing that helps them fly. Tail feathers, on the other hand, are often very flat and squared off at the end and generally very long. So here's a tail of a bird called a ruff grouse, which is a galliform. So it's very similar to quails and partridges. And they have, like many other birds, very broad, rounded tail feathers. These tail feathers are also very similar to, or rather, the birds that don't have similar tail feathers are, of course, wood creepers and woodpeckers, because those birds actually use their tail feathers as a limb, as a sort of third limb to hold on to the prop up against the bark. Okay, so most birds, as I said, have tail feathers and wing feathers, and most of them also have these contour feathers that we talked about. So here's again a contour feather of a helmeted guinea fowl. You find these birds oftentimes as people's pets on farmhouses. They're native to Africa. And here again is that downy part or plumulaceous part of the wing feather, of the contour feather, and the pennaceous part of the contour feather. But a lot of other birds also have other types of feathers, like these semi-plumes. These semi-plumes have a huge part of their feather made up of the plumulaceous structure. Many birds, especially ones that live in really cold areas, have what are called down feathers, which do not have a pennaceous part at all. There is also other types of feathers like bristle feathers, and we'll get into those soon. Here's a bristle feather of a bird called a common poorwill, which is a North American nightjar, and a phyloplume, which is found in domestic chicken. So while birds have all these different types of feathers, all birds don't have every type of feather, but most birds have contour feathers, wing feathers, and tail feathers. Okay, where do feathers grow? Feathers don't grow everywhere on a bird's body. There's only one group of birds, and we'll come to those at the end of the lecture, that grow feathers like a fur. But on our body, on mammals, hair grows throughout the body, and that is not true for most birds. And a great way to see where birds grow feathers is actually look at a chicken. So feathers grow in what is called feather tracts. So there are only specific areas of the bird's body that grows feathers, and that is absolutely clear to see if you go and see frozen chicken at a butcher's place. Now, you may or may not eat chicken, but we all love biology and we are all students of biology. So there's no harm in going and looking at a chicken. And you will see that these ventral or this on this chicken, you can very easily see this spinodorsal tract right here. And then you can also see these ventral tracts, caudal tracts, caudal tracts. All of them are very, very obvious on birds. And so you can also, if ever you get a chance to go bird ringing or bird banding with any class, you can also see these feathers that grow in tracts very, very easily. And so the alar tract here is the one that produces the wing feathers, right? So the alar tract is extremely important. Again, bird feathers do not grow like mammal hair. They grow in feather tracts. Okay, so beyond insulation, beyond flight, beyond crypsis, birds' feathers are also really, really diverse in their structure and form for many other reasons. So, did you know that some birds actually use their feathers to create sound? So, a lot of hummingbirds, some nightjars, some swifts, and this club-winged manakin are all birds that use their feathers, and the club-winged manakin actually has modified feathers that hit against each other faster than you can see and produce a sound. So you should look up videos of a club winged mannequin and see how it the male club winged mannequin has these modified wing feathers to help it create a sound that it uses in its mating display to attract mates. uh, you may have already seen feathers that look like bristles. And so a lot of nightjars and a lot of flycatchers and barbets have feathers that are called rictal bristles that look like my mustache, are thin and long like my mustache, but actually just modified feathers. And these feathers are supposed to be extremely sensitive to movement and to changes in wind pressure. So at night, when nightjars are flying around, they often keep their mouths open, and these feathers are out, sort of sensing the air for any movement and any, the when a moth flies around, it creates disturbance in the air around the nightjar, and that's how it uses its rictal feathers to detect these moths flying at night. Flycatchers will also use these rictal feathers to sort of make the final change in their direction when they're trying to catch an insect. So rictal feathers are really important. Finally, a lot of birds have extremely modified contour feathers, and what better example than our national bird, the Indian peafowl. So here's a male Indian peafowl with its train showing, and while most of you may have been told, or maybe even still think that the feathers that you see the peacock spreading are its tail feathers, that is actually not true. They are modified back feathers. So next time you see a peacock displaying to a female, you should pay close attention. You can actually see that the tail feathers are just normal, long, rounded feathers like most other pheasants, but peacocks, male peafowl, have these modified back feathers that they raise to produce their train. Okay, so how do feathers keep birds warm? And I'm going to get into a little more detail about this because I'm going to talk about some of my own research that has gone to understand this behavior. So, like we talked about, feathers have two parts, the plumulaceous or downy part, and the pennaceous, which is the interlocking part, the part with the interlocking barbs, that is the colorful part. So the prediction in the literature when I started studying feathers is that birds that live in really cold places have feathers that have a bigger proportion of them made up of these downy barbs. So here's an example of a snowy owl that lives in the Arctic and a burrowing owl that lives in warmer areas. And here is an example of how a snowy owl feather, contour feather, so these are both contour or body feathers, how a snowy owl contour feather has a big proportion of the length of the feather made up of these downy barbs, while the burrowing owl, which lives in significantly warmer areas, has a very small proportion of its length made up of downy barbs. The other thing that feather birds can do to keep warm is have really long feathers. So the longer your feathers, the more overlap they have with other feathers, and that makes the plumage deeper, which keeps the cold air out much better than feathers that don't overlap at all. So increasing the length of the downy region and or having really long feathers is both really good for keeping warm, or at least that's what the theory predicts. But we actually didn't know whether this is true for a lot of birds, including Himalayan birds. And so I did some research, and I'm getting into this because a lot of you are just starting your scientific careers or are not professional scientists. And this is I thought, a good way to tell you about how science is done. So this was back in 2019, 2020, when I was working as a research biologist at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., that has a huge collection of Asian birds. And so I wanted to understand whether birds that live in the high elevations of the Himalayas have significantly more downy feathers than birds that live at low elevations. And so what I did was I isolated one feather under a microscope, and here's a feather of a scarlet minivet from the Himalayas. And here's what the microscope is seeing. So here's the tip of my forceps, and this is the downy part of the feather, and this is the colorful part of the feather, right? So you might have thought that minivets, if you've seen minivets, that minivets feathers are all red. That is not true. Only half of the feather of the minivet is red, while the rest is gray because it's the downy part. So I isolated one individual feather, and here I have isolated a feather of a wren babbler from Arunachal Pradesh, and I counted a bunch of different things. So I took a photo and actually measured the total length of the feather, what proportion of the feather was made up of the downy region, and then I also looked at the density of these barbs that come off the central rachis of the feather. So I counted the number of barbules, sorry, of barbs per millimeter. So I counted the proportion of downy to pennaceous. I calculated the total length. I calculated downy and pennaceous barb length and downy and pennaceous barb density. And then I did this for more than 1,700 specimens of 249 species that occur across the Himalayas. And then I mapped those on what is called a bird phylogeny, which controls for the relatedness between two bird species. Okay, so what did we find? We found that overall, birds have more downy feathers at high elevations. So they as you go up in elevation, the downy proportion part of the feather increases in size as you go from low elevation to high elevation. And this is true for all those 249 species. In general, overall, across all those birds, the birds that live at low elevation have a smaller proportion of their contour feathers made up of downy barbs, versus high elevation birds. The other overarching sort of pattern that we found was that small birds have longer feathers than large birds. And so small birds have proportionately longer feathers. So if you compared the feather of a black-throated tit versus the feather of a blue whistling thrush, the black-throated tit has proportionately longer feathers compared to its body size than a blue whistling thrush. And this is true again across all those birds. And so we have shown this in many other birds since. So this original paper was on birds in the Himalayas, but we have not only shown that for birds in the Himalayas, but I've also been on some papers where we have shown this on birds in the Andes. And more recently, we've also shown that this happens even within a bird species across its elevation gradient. So earlier this year, we published a paper with Renu Bala on house sparrows across the elevation gradient in the Himalayas. And we found that sparrows that live at low elevations have less downy back feathers than sparrows that live at high elevations. So let's get into how birds keep their feathers water repellent. And so not only do those feather barbs interlock using barbules, but they also, most birds also sort of line their feathers or with what is called uropygial gland oil or preen oil. So uropygial glands are a gland very similar in structure to sweat glands on our body that produce this type of oil that the birds use to line their feathers. And here's an example of a demoiselle crane taking that oil from its uropygial gland, and then it will use it to put on its wing feathers and tail feathers and body feathers and help keep them water repellent. And here's an amazing photo from Reddit of a common loon with all these with all these little droplets of water on its face. And this just tells you how water repellent bird feathers are. And again, loons are actually diving birds, so they can fly, but they also dive underwater to catch fish. And so they really, really need to be water repellent. So we've talked about feathers. We've talked about how feathers are important for mate attraction. They're important for crypsis. They're important for insulation. They're important for flight. But we have to always remember that their nature and evolution is full of what are called trade-offs. Okay, so there is not one simple structure that is perfect for any one thing, because it is each feather or the structure of each feather is affected by many different things. So here's a great example of a bird called a common eider. Common eider are sea ducks, so they live on the ocean, but they of course breed on land. And here is a male common eider, a female common eider, and the nest of a common eider. And so I'm talking about eiders because eider feathers, eider down feathers, have been used for hundreds and hundreds of years by traditional people to make pillows and to stuff their jackets with, because they are so warm. But as you can see, eider males look very different from eider females, and that's because eider males play no role in incubation of the nest, and most of parental care. So the trade-off of what kind of feather you should have is what is your main function. Now, male eiders have to attract a lot of female mates, and so they look very different. Their feathers are white in color, white and black and yellow in color, and very different looking from the female eider that doesn't have to attract mates, and also more importantly has to camouflage really well. So female eider feathers, so even within one species, the sexes might have completely different types of feathers, structures, and colors. And so the female eider has feathers that look very, very different. It's highly mottled, highly patterned, and that's because she uses that patterning to sort of blend in and camouflage against the bare ground that she breeds on. And this is the third use that eiders make of their feathers. Eiders actually use their feathers to keep their eggs warm. So females will often pluck their own down feathers from their own body and line their nests with their own down feathers and then place their eggs in that little nice cocoon of warmth. And so when the female lies on the eggs like she's doing here, there's they are insulated from the bottom, and she can warm them and incubate them from the top. Eiders, like I said, are seagoing ducks that live in the very north, and so they are found in very high latitudes where it is really, really cold. So what type of feathers a bird has is always a trade-off between what are the different functions that those feathers and the plumage play. And there's always a trade-off between feathers that might keep you warm or feathers that you use for foraging, feathers you use for attracting mates, and feathers you use for crypsis. Okay, so I had told you that there's one group of birds that does grow its feathers like fur, and that group of birds is penguins. And here's a great example of a penguin that does not grow its feathers in tracts like most other birds. Penguins have extremely dense feathers, and while most other birds keep warm by trapping a pocket of air close to their body, and that pocket of air then is warmed by the bird's own body, and as long as the bird doesn't let its that pocket of air escape, it keeps warm. Well, uh, penguins have a lifestyle that doesn't allow for a pocket of air to be kept very close to their skin, because what do penguins do? Penguins dive for their food a lot, and they can't fly. So what penguins have evolved is a dense layer of feathers, just like fur, which is doesn't trap a lot of air, but is so dense that it keeps the bird warm anyways. Penguins also do something that is very different, which is they have subdermal fat, just like we do, and so penguins are a very, very different type of bird. Going on a little tangent, but that pocket of air that we talked about, that penguins don't have because they have extremely dense, short feathers, actually deters many birds from diving. And so all these diving ducks like scorers and eiders and other diving birds like dippers and loons actually have to lose that pocket of air, lose that warmth before they dive, because the moment you dive with a pocket of air around your body, you pop back up because the air makes you buoyant. And so, again, how you use your feathers totally depends on what you're doing. Okay, how are feathers colored? We talked a lot about the downy part of the feather. Let's talk a little bit about the pennaceous or the colorful part of the feather. So, how do birds get their color? The most important thing to remember is that the color that you see is the wavelength of light that the feathers are reflecting, and while absorbing most other wavelengths of light. Okay, so the your perception of a color is totally dependent on what light wavelengths the bird's feather is absorbing versus reflecting. Let's talk about the first type of feathers, which are carotenoid feathers, or carotenoid pigments giving feathers their color. So let's think of all the red birds that you can think of: the reds, the pinks, the yellows. These are all produced by a pigment called carotenoid pigment, which is found in red vegetables. So you guessed it right. Carrots have carotenoids, but birds have to eat something with a carotenoid pigment in it to produce those colors. So a flamingo, which is really pink in color, has to eat something, and so the invertebrates that they eat actually have carotenoids in them, and the flamingos then sequester that carotenoid pigment and convert it into pigments that it can put it in its feathers. Similarly, these are pictures from the textbook. The cardinal, which is this red bird right here, also makes carotenoid pigments from the food it eats. So if you starve a bird of all food that has carotenoids, it cannot make carotenoids and will probably just make a brown cardinal in this case. That other type of color is called structural color and melanin color. So melanins is the same pigment that you and I have in our skin that gives us our skin its color and our hair its color. And so all your browns and blacks are made by melanin. Uh, Melanin is a pigment that the bird can make itself, so it doesn't need anything from the environment. Similarly, it can also produce a structure that it uses melanin and this structure to produce what are called structural pigments, which are your uh, blues and blacks. And so the intense black and the blues that you get or rather blues that are so dark that they look black, are made by what are called structural feathers. The absolute black can be produced by melanin itself. And the third type of feather that you see, or third type of pigment that you see giving feathers colors, is iridescent colors. And these iridescent colors are made up by a very complex three-layer form of pigments that are arranged in a specific order, where the color that you see is totally dependent on the angle of the light that is hitting the bird. So you might see the same bird look a different color in different at different angles. And we have seen we have done that with some of our clothes also, right? Like my mom wears a sari that has iridescent feathers, where you change the angle of the light falling on the sari and it changes the color of the sari. So birds just evolved that millions of years ago on their own. Now, between the last time the textbook was written and now, there has been an additional type of color that was only described back then but is now an actual thing, and that is called super black. So super black is a type of um, color that birds have, where the bird's feathers absorb 95% or more of all the light that is uh, incident on the bird. And so it produces this intensely dark, intensely black color, which looks like it's absorbing, sucking in all the light. And this type of color was originally described in birds of paradise that live in Papua New Guinea and Australia, but has since been described in a few other types of birds as well. And so super black is a fourth type of coloration that birds have. So, can birds have all different types of feathers, all different types of pigments on one bird? Yes, many birds have multiple types of feathers. Like you can think of a chloropsis that has green feathers and black feathers and yellow feathers, and those are all using different structures. Here's a Wilson's bird of paradise from Papua New Guinea again, which has several different kinds. So it probably has some super black feathers on its chest. It has these bright red feathers that are made from carotenoid pigments on its back, yellow feathers, carotenoid pigments. It has this blue patch of bare skin that is structural pigments on its head. It also has these iridescent feathers on at the top of its wings. And so there are many birds out there that actually have all these different types of pigments in on the same bird. Now, is there a rule for how birds might be colored? There might be some other rules that I can, but the one that I can think of very easily is what is called Glosier's rule. And these screech owls from North America actually have a really good, or a great example of how Glosier's rule exists. And this rule has now been suggested in tawny owls in Asia as well. So what does Glosier's rule say? Glosier's rule says that a bird that lives in a darker place, more humid place, more tropical place will have darker feathers than a bird that lives in a higher latitude, so colder place, with more solar radiation and lower temperature. And so birds that live at in the open and high latitudes in cold environments with a lot of solar radiation will have gray feathers, while birds that live in the understory of equatorial rainforests where it is warm will have more red feathers. And even within North America, the eastern screech owl that lives at in warm and humid environments has this red, darker red, richer rufous color, and screech owls that live up in the north have this more drab gray white coloration. So just where you live might drive the color of the plumage in birds. Now, feathers are like hair, and just like we grow and shed hair all the time, birds do that as well. And so most birds are will replace all their feathers at least once a year. Many birds do that twice a year. So a great example is all our leaf warblers, right? So a lot of migratory birds, or all these shorebirds that you see on the coast, they often molt twice because they once molt into their breeding plumage and then again molt into their non-breeding plumage. And so bird feathers are shed, and they are shed sometimes sequentially. Like this gull right here is shedding all its primary feather, all its secondary feathers together. They also shed it is also shedding its primary feathers. And birds also shed and replace their contour feathers. So here's a great example of a cardinal that has lost all its head feathers, and you can see the dark skin underneath. And you might see birds around you after the summer, so like in the middle of the monsoon or late monsoons. And every year on Facebook groups, I see feathers or photos of common menas with completely bald heads, and those are just molting birds. It's a normal, natural process that all birds go through. So how do birds mold feathers? So birds might mold feathers sequentially. So they might do it symmetrically. So the ninth primary will fall out on both wings simultaneously, and then the eighth, and then the sixth, and the seventh, and all that. They might do that for the same for the tails also. Some birds lose their outermost tail feathers, or retrix as they're called, retrices, or they might start inside and then go out. Some birds, like ducks, often lose all their flight feathers together at the same time, and then they're actually flightless. So, ducks are a good example. Darters or anhingas also do that, where they lose all their flight feathers simultaneously and are actually flightless for a few weeks before they regrow them. Uh, but there that process of molting is actually really helpful for us to age birds often. So here's a great example of a a herring gull that is going through multiple different mold stages before it molds into an adult plumage. And so here's a uh, newly born, newly fledged herring gull in juvenile plumage, and then it progressively gets whiter and whiter until it becomes an adult and has these completely white head and light gray wings, versus all these other stages that it does over time. So it might take the fourth year in some birds to get adult plumage, and this is true for a lot of gulls. It's true for a lot of eagles. It's in even in other birds like Asian bird of paradise. You might see uh, the males that are recently out of a nest look like females. Then they get this brown morph with brown long tail feathers, and then they become adults with long white, completely white tail feathers. So bird mold is not only important for replacing worn, damaged feathers, but it is also important because birds actually change the way they look, or may change the way they look by molding into a different type of plumage. The Another cool thing about bird feathers is because they are grown every year, they are a snapshot of what is happening to the bird at that time. And so here is a thing called a fault bar growing in a bird feather, and fault bars are actually tied to a time of feather growth when the bird was either really stressed or didn't get enough food, or both. And so scientists can look at the position of the fault bar, and decide, or look at the number of fault bars on a bird's feather and decide, or tell whether the bird was stressed during the growth of that feather. And you can do that for nestlings, you can do that for adults. Again, fault bars are really, really cool way of understanding how bird feathers grow, and while they are growing, what is the bird going through as it's growing its feathers. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to this lecture on bird feathers. It's been great telling you about this. I'm going to leave you with this amazing photo of a superb bird of paradise showing its iridescent feathers, and its super black feathers, and its really cool yellow inside of its mouth, or the yellow gape. Uh, Take care and happy birding.